The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. My name is Melissa Miller. I am a scientist and science writer, and write freelance articles for Star Wars Insider magazine, which sadly is having its last issue coming up here in a few months.
I'm your other co-host, James Floyd. I also write for Star Wars Insider Magazine and StarWars.com. In this episode, Star Warsologies is going to chat about classical studies and Star Wars. Our guest expert today is Giraffe, a classicist and educator and Star Trek podcast host. Welcome!
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, I'm excited. We have met and hang out at conventions and stuff together. Always you're in amazing cosplay. A lot of times we're talking Star Trek, so I'm sort of excited to hear more about Star Wars from your perspective.
Yeah.
I'm crossing the galactic barrier.
Exactly.
Can you tell us what is classic studies? Is it classical studies? Classic studies?
It's very interesting because it varies. So I studied in Europe. I'm going to start by this. I'm French. In France, classics are the study of ancient Greek and Latin and the study of its literature and language and linguistics. I started by studying archeology, and archeology in France is linked with history of art because archeology in Europe was all about pillaging places. Yay! But I was always fascinated by ancient Greek. I started ancient Greek in 7th grade, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's been some time. And when I went to college, I just wanted to continue studying ancient Greek. And I was lucky enough that in Europe, you can actually study classics and archaeology that goes towards the field of epigraphy, which is the study in archaeology of objects having something written on it to make it simple, right? Mm-hmm. And in the US, classics is quite the same, but the link to archaeology is not always that easy, I would say. And archaeology in the US is linked to anthropology, which makes way more sense as it's the study of human traces. Mm-hmm. So anthropology is quite important, right? So yeah, I studied a lot of Latin, a lot of ancient Greek. I dabbled in a lot of different ancient languages here and there.
I wonder if the main difference in archaeology in Europe and in America is that Europe has all sorts of ancient Greek and Roman stuff, whereas America, we got none of that. So it's like we're going to focus on our stuff and all the cool stuff that we have and not so much about looting Greek and Roman cultures. There's all sorts of other stuff we can loot.
Right. Don't worry. We'll still loot. Yeah.
Well, the field of classics is quite ancient. He's actually older than the field of archaeology, because the study of Latin and Greek in Europe was always linked to, the study of law or scriptures and theology, for example. So learning Latin is still part of the French national education. I teach Latin for that reason. That's how I still have a job. But you have a lot of, in the continent of America, the Americas plural, right? You still have classics in the sense of ancient languages, not Latin and Greek, for sure exist still in Mesoamerica, for example, or you have ancient written language in North America also. But yeah, due to the history of colonization of America, it's a different rapport between the different sciences and studies.
Yeah. Did Star Wars influence your career path at all, or other pop culture properties?
So not Star Wars at all, but I was fascinated by Stargate, and I wanted to be Dr. Daniel Jackson. The fact that he could just read any ancient languages like that fascinated teenage me. I was already studying ancient Greek at that time, so you can imagine that I was like, wait, that's a job? That's a job I can do? And then we're talking about The Mummy. Yep. Evie, same thing, just being able to open a book and read all those ancient languages was just absolutely fascinating to me. I grew up in Lyon, which was one of the Roman capital of the Gaul world, Celtic Gauls, There were Latin inscriptions everywhere. Like still now, like every corner of a street, you have a Roman inscription embedded in a wall. You know, the little square next to my place had a Roman fountain that was there for 2,000 years with still an inscription on it. So I used to walk through those remnant of the past, and I just wanted to know what was written on that thing.
Yeah,
I would too.
So yeah, I would say that I always had the interest of the ancient world through where I was born. But then the big franchises for me was mostly, Stargate, I would say, The Mummy, and Star Trek. Just for the love of languages, I identified with Uhura a lot, and that's why I also speak quite a number of modern languages. I just like talking.
Is Klingon one of the languages you know?
I don't know any novel. So, like, I don't know how you call those in English, but, you know, like those made-up languages.
Right.
I don't know them.
Constructed.
Yeah, constructing languages. We call them novlangues in French, new languages. And, I don't know them, no.
Yeah, that's okay.
I don't think I have space in it. I want to add that what interests me the most in a language is the linguistic of it. So the history of that language, how we came to say things that way, or that word changes through time on how we pronounce things, or how we borrow languages through our contact with other people. And I feel like those construction languages lack that. To me, speaking a language is a link to the past, is a human link to people that were here before me. So constructed languages don't have that.
Yeah, they're getting better and better. I know. We talked to David Peterson, right, who's like created them for Game of Thrones and Marvel Universe and stuff like that. And I think that's what always annoyed him about constructed languages is like with Star Wars, we talked about, it's like, it's literally just a font, right? It's like they use A through Z and they just have a font. And we don't get to hear Arabic. And, but yeah, in order to give it more of a feeling, you have to think about the way languages develop and where you are. Is this a brand new language in the universe, or is this thousands of years old? You know, those are going to be different.
Well,
and I love the fact that, you know, sci-fi franchises, like, I mean, Star Trek is going on 60 years next year. So you had these interest of like creating those languages to match a font, right? Like Vulcan is a language that you can learn. Klingon is a language that you can learn. Like you can even flip your Netflix to Klingon if you want.
Nice.
So there's a font, yes, but it writes a language. And I feel we kind of like gave up a little bit on this. I mean, there's Game of Thrones. You have it in Stargate a little bit too. But right now it's a lot of English language written in, you know, fun fonts. And the linguist in me is sad when I can recognize the flow of an English sentence and they're like, it's Betazoid. It's not it's English.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in Star Wars, there are other, you know, constructed languages. There's Huttese, which, you know, again, these don't have huge vocabularies, but Mandalorian in the Legends era, there's an author who really latched on to making Mandalorian culture, and she made a huge amount of Mandalorian, not only vocabulary, but also sentence structure and some even dialectical things. Like most of the time, most standard Mandalorian speakers don't have a letter F. But when they borrow words like from Huttese, Fearfek in Huttese means poison, but it also, you know, expands to something else to just like something that will kill you or a bad fate. But the Mandalorians drew that in and they had to kind of make an F sound just for these loan words.
That's interesting because ancient Greek doesn't really have an F sound. The PH that we have in philosophy, for example, where the Latin hearing the phi letter, phi sound by the Greeks, and they didn't use F. There is an F in Latin. They transcribed it with PH, which tells you that it was not the sound. It was mostly a aspired P. And you have this in Arabic also with, you know, there's no P in classic Arabic, but then other languages that use Arabic, it's not an alphabet exactly, script, had to create new ways to add that P. And that's why, for example, you have a P in Farsi, you have a P, for example, in languages that are not based out of the Arabic language, but that use the script. That's fascinating to me. That's really interesting. That's what I like in learning languages. See, those little nuggets of what do we do with that new invention and how do we make it our own when it comes from somebody else, basically.
Cool. Well, definitely constructing languages or whatever makes me think a little bit of Yoda. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about, I mean, it really is just sentence structure, right? Verbs, object, noun, or whatever, being in a sort of jumbled state. But I'm curious if that gives you any thoughts about maybe Yoda's first learned language, that's the way their sentences are structured. So even after Yoda learns basic or whatever, I keep waiting for Grogu, for baby Yoda to start speaking in The Mandalorian so we can kind of understand if it's inherent to the species or what. Any guesses?
How we structure sentences come from, the history of your language, right? For example, French, if you take French, like Latin languages, so Latin has a declension system, which means that you can put the words in not any places you want in the sentence, but you're freer than in English or French, where basically the sentence structure, the place and the job of your word in the sentence will depend on where it is. That your subject has to be before your verb, and that will be the word that does the action. When you use declensions, for sure you can move this around because the word will have in itself the mark that it is the subject. In Turkish, for example, is the same thing. You're going to add suffixes at the end of the word to help creating that notion around the word, like that grammatical notion. So the question is, Yoda speaks basic. Basic is English. We're just going to go. Basic is English. And that if he jumbles his word, that's most probably because his native language has this sentence structure. But when you learn a foreign language, you learn to juggle with another sentence structure, right? So my theory is that Yoda is just being extra.
Yeah.
It's his way to differentiate himself. And as long as you don't have anybody else from the same, and it's not even a question of species, because one of my pet peeves in sci-fi is that usually one planet, one culture, one language, which is really weird because we see how fast humans just bend their language to their social groups. Like we see with, for example, all the Gen Zs, language evolves really fast, really fast. If you take 100 of us and you put us on Mars, in 10 years, we're going to start speaking something quite different if we cannot have contact with Earth. So imagine in a planet like Tatooine, for example, which is not so easy to travel back and forth. You'd think that you would have different languages, especially if you have Huttese over there, if you speak basic, but you always interact with Huttese. At one point, your language is going to start bearing the mark of this language, right?
Right.
So Yoda having a species that just speak like that doesn't make sense for humans, at least.
Right. Yeah.
I just thought of something that he's, hundreds of years old. So maybe his grammar structure that he speaks is where language was when he was a youth, and it's evolved over hundreds of years to put a different order. But I also like your idea of he's just being difficult on purpose because he's like, I can get away with this because I'm Yoda. It makes people think more about my words, so they'll listen better.
My other idea is that it's something that has a cultural meaning, which means that not religiously but maybe a belief that it's how you should say your words, and that's something he believes in, that's something that helps him, but definitely doesn't help the other people around him.
Right. So curious to see what they decide, and maybe they don't have to. Maybe Grogu will not speak in the movie or what. But I was like, someone has to decide. Someone in the Star Wars lore and the Star Wars decision tree has to decide if Baby Yoda's first sentence is going to be, structured the same way as Yoda's. I love the idea, mind you, that 800 years in the past when Yoda learned to speak, that's just the way language was. But then they'd have to put that into the High Republic or whatever,
Well, the main question is why doesn't he change? Because we, at least humans, I don't know for Yoda, but humans, we mimic. Right? All primates, really, we're good at mimicking, right? And that's how we learn language, by repetition, by mimicking. Like you see, the babble of babies imitate the frequency and the structure of the spoken language that they're learning. So that's how early we mimic. Like a French baby doesn't babble the same way that an American baby babbles. So normally after a long time enough with people, you just pick it up. You pick up the accent. Like I have, sure, a French accent, but also an American accent. If I had learned English in the UK, I would not speak English right now with that intonation in my words. And in classics, come back to my to what I know in epigraphy, that's something that's always was very interesting to me, at least in Lyon, which was a capital, so a Roman Empire capital, which means that they had so many people from all over the place coming there just because, first of all, the Roman army was stationed there. So you had, army men from anywhere, right? Because they had to go all around the empire, but you had also magistrate, you had also just the local population, and the Gauls had one of their main temple, they were in the main sanctuary where they would meet once a year to pay tribute to Rome and August. So that means that you had also a bunch of different Celtic tribes who would come and meet in this city. And people would die, people would have to write, epitaphs. So we have a bunch of written texts that is Latin for sure, but Latin written by a bunch of different people that were native speakers of other languages. And you can see that transpire in the way they write, because as much as language is something that comes to us very early before we know how to read or how to write, writing though is a different monster, right? And when you're a native speaker, writing in a foreign language means that you're gonna make mistakes. And we see epitaphs that are clearly written by Greek native speakers, because you can see that they're going to use a K, for example, a kappa, right? For the C in Latin, the way that some of the Latin declension will be wrong because they're mimicking a sentence structure from Greek. And for example, also Celtic names would not match the Latin declension. So when you had people that were from the local Celtic tribe, for example, that had Celtic names, then those names would be changed at the end to be able to match the Latin declensions. And also we found inscription written in Greek script, Greek alphabet, but that actually are written in Celtic language. So the Gauls would use Greek alphabet to write their language and their names, because that was the first alphabet they actually came in contact with, apparently.
Really?
Thanks to Massalia. Massalia was a Greek colony, Marseille was a Greek colony, and we find Greek items like vases and Greek art in Celtic tombs quite early, before the Roman conquest, actually. Okay, one thing, Greeks go everywhere. If that one thing I learned from studying Africa in antiquity, you will find random Greeks left and right. These guys travel. They take boats, they go, they settle, mostly because when they would come and settle a new colony, for example, it would be one city, but they were not, like, because of their city-state system, they were not expansionists like the Romans. Their goal was to create a new city, they would create their city, they would like exchange and trade, and then, usually kind of dilute themselves into local people, right? When Romans didn't come just to settle a city. They settled city, they settled roads. You had to honor Rome and August. That was the basic thing they wanted you to do. And then you had somehow to learn Latin. We still have those manuals that would give Roman functionaries that were basically, when you used to travel before internet and you had these little books of sentences and they were written like, in English and in French, for example, and then they were like phonetics.
Right.
And we have this for Greek and Latin, for example. And that's super interesting because we can see how the words were pronounced, which is something we don't really know unless people do writing mistakes. Or we get those papyri. So those were found in Egypt, which is pretty cool.
Wow.
I went on sidetrack, sorry.
It's okay.
No.
I was now thinking, how we talk about languages kind of translating through other alphabets and stuff. And so that's like why you'd have a Celtic, maybe Arthur, but in Latin it would be like Artoria, maybe. when you have someone like C-3PO who learns millions of languages, and it could be that he learns them separate because he's a droid, he doesn't frame them through any sort of original reference thing that he's thinking in, unless it's some sort of computer binary. So do you think he would be able to like keep everything straight, or would he be like, oh, this writing means one thing if I'm looking at it in this language, but no, it's really a bastardization of these other people using this alphabetic written structure?
Like 10 years ago, I would have told you, no, I don't think a droid can do that. And now when I see AI and even the translators that exist, like when you speak into your phone and it just translates in another language, I'm on the fence. I think that the problem with technology and C-3PO just learning a database of language is that language evolve. It would need to be endlessly updated. But if we think that every time he speaks with somebody in a language, then he auto-updates himself and he learns, then yeah, I suppose. The good thing about a droid being able to master so many languages is that it doesn't forget or it doesn't become rusty, which is something that definitely happens to humans if you don't practice a language. But there is a real question about... So we're talking about me being an educator, and I worked in bilingual education for 20 years. So the way children learn languages and the way how we become bilingual, for example, and when I say bilingual, is really growing into two languages at the same time. I'm not bilingual. I learned English way late in my life. I'm semi-fluent. It's always the question of how we adapt to a situation and how we use language in the different tones of what the situation calls for. And C-3PO is very awkward. Like, we all agree on this. He has no context. He doesn't understand context. And that's the thing that is really interesting in languages. It all depends on which context you are using that language. When we're talking about the Jedi sacred text, right? And the question is, well, for humans at least, sacred texts are written a certain way, and the language in those texts is stuck. We don't changing. It's an older form of the language that we speak now. Sometimes it's a dead language, and when I say dead, I don't like saying dead. I like saying ancient, but dead in the idea that it didn't give any offspring, or it's not a language. For example, Greek is not dead. You can still learn modern Greek, right? So that's also the question of how much do you need a C-3PO to understand a language that is too old for you to be able to organically learn it.
Right. Yeah, because it's interesting. I'm trying to think of different language or different, terms that C-3PO has used. Definitely with the Ewok, I feel like he says it's an older dialect or something like that.
Primitive dialect.
Primitive dialect.
Ooh,
even, right? Which is
right,
exactly. No, I was I know it's 1983 or whatever, but I'm sure that's not how we refer to things.
You have Proto-Bash, which is super interesting. So you have Orbash, right? And apparently there's a Proto-Bash. And what is really interested me is that it seems that the letters are way rounder because most of it was not written for computers or, electronic devices. And Orbash seems to be way more computerized. And that's an interesting also evolution of script, because we spoke a lot of language, but one of my other pet peeve, I have many, I love sci-fi, but is that there very often a lack of understanding between script and language. For example, French and English and Spanish and a bunch of other languages use Latin script. Sometimes also languages will use older script that are not adapted to their language. So for example, Greek never used its own script. Every script that Greek has used is borrowed from somebody else. So it used to be written in Linear B, which was a language that was syllabic. So that means that one symbol equals one syllable. You have to learn a lot of symbols, right? And it was the script for what we suppose was Minoan. But we don't know what language was Minoan because every single script, every single tablet we found was written in Greek. So that's how they were able to back up on understanding Linear B, is that at one point they were it's writing Greek, and we know Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So from knowing Greek, we can match words and start understanding syllabic. But Greek is not a syllabic language, which means that it's kind of wonky to write Greek in a syllabic script. That's why at one point they were like, yeah, I think those Phoenicians have a better system. And they took the Phoenician alphabet, which is way faster to learn and way faster to write. And one of my favorite thing is that in the Odyssey, there is one reference of written language. It's at one point, I think, Ulysses says, you have like a guy on the ship that is here to write. So ships must have one guy that knows how to write and read to keep inventory, basically. But that tells you that writing is not a given for all cultures, and it's pretty recent in the history of humanity. And having a proto-bash going to an or-bash, like I start thinking, okay, so who invented that thing? Who was writing this? And it is an alphabet, which is alpha, beta, and or-bash is the two first letter of the alphabet too. So that's kind of cool. But it lacks a language. For what language was that script created? Do we know that? We don't know that, right?
I know you probably did a much deeper dive than I did on this. I was just thinking of using the linear B example of syllabic. It would be like writing English words, but using, there's like several different Japanese writing systems, and one is completely syllabic. Yeah. Hiragana, thank you.
Yeah.
So it'd be writing in English using hiragana, and obviously it doesn't match up.
And funnily, the word that broke linear B was tripod. Because tripod, you have the T and the R, right? That a syllabic system cannot write. They are going to write T, ri, po, de, right? And the thing is that they had this tablet, and very clearly they were counting tripods that were donated to a temple, apparently. And you had a little, like, drawing of a tripod. You cannot mistake a tripod. It's like a little, like, cup and 3 feet, right? And Greek would use a certain number of letters to write in alphabetical script, but this one would use T, ri, po, de, 4 symbols, and they keep seeing the 4 symbol and the tripod, and they were like, is it a syllabic? And then from there, basically you can recognize a syllabic just by counting the number of symbols. If it's more than like, an usual alphabet, it's going to be a syllabic, right? And then from there, they were able to reconstruct a bunch of different languages once they knew it's Greek. And that's always the question. Sometimes you know the script, but you don't know the language. Sometimes you know the language and you don't know the script. So the only way you can go around is if you know the language, you can crack the script. But when you don't know the language, you cannot understand what is being written. And that's where the Rosetta Stone was instrumental to breaking hieroglyphic script, because from having it in different language, they were able to be, this is what it means. There are a lot of scripts that we have not cracked because we don't know what language is being written. You can always extrapolate from the local languages being spoken, but a lot of languages are Semitic in East Africa and the Horn of Africa. But from there, of being able to read an inscription that is thousands of years old, that's a bigger step, right? So there's a lot of inscription in epigraphy that we can't read because we don't know the language. They're using AI models now to try to find out what some of those mean, and as much as I don't like it, I'm also very curious.
Right.
And I will say that for a region as Sudan that is going through a lot of political turmoil and a lot of instability, archaeology can bring a lot of stability to a country once they can be connected to a past that gives an identity and like reinforce them into, who they are. Like look at Greece, for example. Greece, without archaeology, would lose a lot of their tourism. Growing in a place, knowing your history is really important. It helps a lot to communities to know where they're from. That's why the first thing that you do to dismantle societies, like disconnecting them from their history.
Right.
I'm saying that, not saying anything.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, see our anti-fascism episode for a few months ago. We touched on AI a little bit and, for language models, and I use Google Translate, right, when I travel and things like that. But it does make me think about, with the technology we see in Star Wars, space travel and fighter jets and all this sort of stuff, the idea that they're still using a droid as their sort of the closest thing to a universal translator, right, in Star Wars is C-3PO, essentially. How many languages, James?
I think he's fluent in over 6 million languages, but then in Rise of Skywalker up to 7. So he has been learning new stuff or uploading it.
But the question stays of like, what do people speak? If you have machines that can just speak any language and make you understand whatever language you speak, what happens to learning other languages? Like, is BASIC a foreign language to all?
Right.
That everybody learns as a lingua franca to be able to interact, like Latin or Greek, for example, were in the antiquity. So everybody has a native language, and then on top of it, a conversational language. You see that in Firefly. In Firefly, it's very interesting. They speak English, Chinese, Creole. That is the given language that you use. In Star Trek, you have the universal translator, which means that everybody speaks their native language, hears their native language, and then basically just translated automatically, which is fascinating. In Discovery, you have that episode where the translator breaks and nobody is able to, they are literally stuck in space because they can't interact. And there's one guy who grew up in a planet that was not contacted, who just went through the effort of learning like 10 languages and he becomes a translator. But it also begs the question, speaking different languages is good for us. It molds our brain. We see the world through the languages we speak. That's something in education that is very interesting. When you talk with children who grew up in different languages, they are able to solve some problem in different ways depending on what language they're going to use to input and output. Like get the information, work the information, and output is like 3 different gestures, right? And the more language you speak, the more you're able to shift to other languages to find another solution. So usually being bilingual, trilingual, or polyglot makes you more able to find new solutions to things. And it's interesting in Africa, for example, my dad is from East Africa. Everybody speaks several languages. Right. Because you have to, right? That's how it is. But it would be interesting to also ponder how nobody learning another language or everybody just speaking BASIC in Star Wars world impact relationship between species.
Right.
Are they species who refuses to learn BASIC? We were speaking about the Wookiees, right?
Right.
And that's always the question, are they able to form those words with their head and their mouth or choose not to? Because choosing not to is really interesting also.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. It says something about the culture for sure, if not just the individual. I've definitely thought about the Han and Chewie thing, right, where they're both speaking their native language but can clearly understand each other. If you've seen the movie Solo, there's like kind of a throwaway little scene or whatever where like Han speaks enough Wookiee. Oh, sorry, Kashyyyk, right? No, that's the planet. So is it Wookiees? I don't actually know.
Just Wookiee. Wookiee's fine.
Speak Wookiee. And I think even mentions he like took it as an elective, or something like that, like took a class. Like that's the only mention of like learning another language that I can at least think of.
Shriwook. That's it. That's what
Shriwook. I was like, I know there's a name. I just couldn't remember. Thank you. But it's interesting, James, I didn't notice that C-3PO's number of forms of communication goes up from the original trilogy to the sequel. That is interesting because when we mentioned C-3PO, I was like, seems like the kind of droid who would like not necessarily be updating. So it's like what, like every year do you plug in, you get other universal translator droid, their experience, your experience. I mean, it gets reset at some point. Does that all go away, or is that when you then update,
and the question is like, is he able like to speak also languages that are not sound based? Because our language is sound-based, but we were speaking about sign languages, for example.
Right.
And multiple species would mean that you would have species that maybe use pheromones or use chemistry or
my God.
In Star Trek, you have a species that use lights movement to speak. And you have also species that use light flashes to communicate. And So then what?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I really hope so, because he specifically says forms of communication, I think, right? I would love, oh man, I want an episode of something where, C-3PO just like has lights or like pheromones or, you know, like mixes up a little chemistry, you know, something.
I'm just imagining him, okay, I got to do a sign language, but I'm limited to like humanish arms, but this is a tentacle-based species that does tentacle-based sign language and needs like 6 different tentacles, and he's got to figure out how to adapt it. But I think, you know, the way that like Han can speak Shriwook, maybe there's just like the very basic, is it Pidgin? That it's kind of like made it as a common language. And so it's like the 6 tentacle people just like know when a 2-armed person does it. Okay, very simple, spelling it out, we can understand.
That always begs the question also, then a protocol droid is necessary in this situation, because I cannot emit pheromones to communicate. I cannot analyze them either. So that's where those droids would be really important in a society, basically a system where you have to interact with so many different species. If we had to interact with ants, for example, we would need a droid, because we just can't produce this. And I think that the whole question for me when I watch Star Wars and also when I watch Star Trek is, how do they keep their history then? We talked about the Jedi archives, right? And the Jedi temples but what about the Wookiees? Is it an oral tradition only? Do they have written text? Or those written texts written in Orbesh? I have a lot of questions. I know nobody else is interested in this.
This is why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Like in Ahsoka, I think in the first episode, they go to that like archaeological site, I suppose I'm gonna call it. And I'm just like, how is there like so much like underground thing? How are those things all? And then they just blow up half of it. And I'm like, nobody cares? Is it nobody's history? Is it nobody's sacred place? You know, we see Luke Skywalker like rebuild Jedi Temple, right, in the movies. And I'm just like, by himself? Is there a tradition? Is there like, I don't know, anybody? Like those texts that are just kept there in moisture. Like I'm just like, you give it to a droid, like for safekeeping. And droid history, because droid have a language. And I know we don't talk about droids, we don't know they're sentient, but like
I know, but like, you know, R2-D2 speaking clearly a different dialect from BB-8, you know, later. So, you know, there is subtlety there or change or something.
Is he, or they just have different voices? That we speak the same language, but no one would say, hey, Melissa and James are not speaking the same language just because we have different voices.
Only so like Chopper is speaking another language.
Yeah, Chopper.
Right, yes, Chopper. Right. Chopper has that's true. I mean, so maybe BB-8 just has like a lisp or something equivalent. Like, I don't know. I never thought about that. I always just figured it was like, you know, updating operating system and, you know, sounds a little different now or something. Or, you know, the Empire's imperial rules sort of influence on things could be applied in many different ways. It could be, you know, maybe there's fewer protocol droids because the Empire just expects everyone, to learn basic or get cut right out.
That's a classic thing that happens. Like, removing the ability to speak in another language that you cannot understand also impacts cultural interaction and cultural practices. Like France in the 19th century banned every single dialect in France and imposed French language, like the central one, the basic one, to everyone. It's a form of punishment. It's also a form of like disruption, and also that makes people unable to read their history or access their history because they need a language that they don't read anymore, they don't know anymore, they cannot speak anymore. That's what happened to a lot of indigenous culture also. Removing the ability to access your oral tradition or removing your ability to access text makes you free for the grabs, basically. Residential schools, it's a huge way of disrupting a culture. You take the children, you don't let them learn their native language, and you teach them the language of the colonizer, and then they can go back home. And it's done. So,
we know that's what happened with stormtroopers, right? Picking up kids from all sorts of planets.
Yeah. And then they just look towards you for help and support. And that is interesting to see that the Empire does the same thing. Like in Endor, with the whole question of those planets speaking other languages and then having that, well, can they understand us? How do you spy on people if you don't know their language?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
This question of seeing the past, maybe in Skeleton Crew, I think that was kind of the most interesting, like, again, we're speaking about pocket of civilization, like, you know, when you get separated from the lot. For a planet that has been separated for so long, it's interesting how they didn't evolve a different language.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking when you said that earlier, The Expanse came to mind, right? You
Yes.
know, as like they had, you know,
Belters.
people from the,
Belter.
right, Belters,
Yeah.
the Martians, right? And some of that was just in their casting of, you know, humans here on Earth, right? It was like all the Australians played Martians and the people from South Africa, you know, were the Belters or whatever. But it's like, that felt so immediately right to me, even as someone who like doesn't know, this isn't my field. I was like, of course that would happen.
And what is interesting in Skeleton Crew is that education is central. They learn to read and write and they go to school and they have like this whole career path. And when you have a language that is stuck, that's what French does. Like French has stuck the grammar of French in like the 18th century with the French Academy, which keeps written French and spoken French in a certain antiquated form, but that basically is what everybody needs to learn, everybody needs to write, everybody needs to read. Then spoken language around it evolves, and that's why there's such a bigger and bigger disconnect between spoken French and written French. We have full tenses that are totally obsolete that we don't use anymore when we speak, but we use when we write or read, which is really interesting in itself. So people are always like, French is so hard to learn because you're learning written French, and that French just had been stuck by the academy into a certain form. But if you just want to learn how to speak, it's like every language, you know, it goes towards being efficient, shortened, and fast. I think in Skeleton Crew, what's interesting is that most probably they kept their language from evolving too far away because all those kids goes to school, they learn those texts, they learn how to read. But then how do they understand the pirates? That's my other question.
Right.
Everybody understands pirates. You just go, "Arr!" I think one of that staticness is now not only just with like written languages, but it's now because we have audio and video recordings of people speaking. So it's like, oh, we have to match these. Or if we drift too far away, are we going to be able to like watch Star Wars, 300 years from now and be like, I don't know what they're saying.
I'm going to tell you something very interesting from being a teacher. When I was a kid, I was able to read some text from the 16th century and understand most of it. Those texts are not being understood nowadays, kids. So in those decades, French has changed already enough that some texts from the 16th century that I was able to understand at school-ish are now not even part of the program because it's already too far and too obsolete, too old, right? So think about Shakespeare. The kids cannot just read Shakespeare. They don't understand it. But when did the divide happen? And that's a very interesting question in epigraphy, actually, and in ancient languages. It's very interesting for Latin to know when Latin went from being a language that people could speak and understand and was like used by everybody to basically be a language that you needed to learn to be able to read and write. And in France, for example, we date that change around the Romance languages, which is, I would say like 8th century, 7th century, because very clearly people needed to be clerk to be able to write and read Latin. And some of the documents are written in a Romance language, which is like a mix between Latin and Germanic. And that happens also with conquest, because the question of the empire is that what does the empire speak? When they arrive somewhere, is imposing language, is it a part of their tactic? It doesn't seem so. It doesn't seem like they're imposing a certain way of writing or a certain way of speaking.
I was thinking about it on Gorman. So in Andor.
Gorman, yeah.
Yeah.
Remind me, is in Gorman when they're singing their like protest song, that's in a different language, right?
Yeah, that's
so we don't necessarily see the Empire imposing their language, but we see speaking your native language as an act of rebellion. So like it kind of implies it at least.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's, like Gorman is heavily inspired from French. It was really hard for me to watch those episodes because my ear kept like trying to understand what they were saying. But language as a form of protest is something that we've seen over and over again, right? And that's why Wookiee not speaking basic could be a really interesting side story, you know, because in Solo we see also how they're treated and the history of them being like enslaved. So them refusing to speak the language of oppression would be really interesting.
Right, exactly. It's like maybe it's biology, but maybe it is just that.
Maybe they're refusing it and then they just say, "Oh, it's biology. We can't speak your language. Sorry."
Yeah.
But it's really a giant conspiracy.
I like how we speak about this as like it's all real. I know it's not. Having more in sci-fi, I think, like, those reflection around languages and around archaeological sites or even the history of the people is just, I think, really interesting. And I think Star Wars is actually going in a more interesting place than Star Trek on this, especially with Andor, because, again, with Gorman, we really see the importance of the native language and the association to the culture of the planet and the people that are resisting an invasion, basically. I mean, destruction also, but, and I feel that the question of how we bring our culture and how we bring our history and how we bring our knowledge with us in sci-fi is kind of often brushed away in Star Trek, for example, because it's utopia. So we all understand each other's, you know, we're all good with this. And the only archaeology you see is always kind of Indiana Jonesy, right? When I feel that in Star Wars, usually when they encounter archaeology, it's often linked to Jedi history. And in The Acolyte, we see that question with the witches. They have their own temples, and that is a problem. So also that question of having your own rights and your own temples and your own religion and your own language separated from the main frame of Star Wars political system or the Jedi belief system, how disruptive it is very, I think it's interesting question that are being asked in Star Wars.
Just thinking about the writing systems and what it means to write. You know, you talk about the proto-Besh and it's like, how would you write Arabesh? That just seems like really clunky to write because it's not like cursive or anything, or even, and it's more complicated than block printing because you're so picking up the pen so many times.
Do you ever see anybody writing in Star Wars?
That's it. Exactly. That you don't.
Exactly. So that's the question also. I mean, I don't know how often you pick up a pen, but a lot of people don't pick up pens anymore. They type on their phone. No, I do too because I'm a nerd, but people type on their phone mostly. And now a lot of people are using voice to text also. There's that whole question is where are we going with the written language? But again, if we're going back to an oral tradition, that'd be cool. I want to see how that goes for science, for example. Because keeping knowledge in books is so useful. But the question is also, written language is very often linked to what materials we have. For example, Egyptian is very interesting because you're going to have the hieroglyphic, which is hieros, you know, like sacred text. And then you have demotic, which is the handwritten one. And it's so different. Like, I highly encourage people to just look. Have you ever seen Cyrillic alphabet handwritten? It's crazy to see Russian written by hand. It looks so different. That's why I was going with the Proto-Besh and the Arbesh, which is interesting how they look different because most probably it's using a different media. So I think that it's always the question of practicality, right? Written language answers a need from us to leave a trace. I think for Star Wars, it's interesting to see how language is very often an afterthought and it's often associated to something magical. I will say that, like the Jedi temples, for instance, Jedi texts. words have magic in even the earliest like writing systems. You don't write whatever. I mean, you're going to count cattle for sure, but also you're going to pray to a goddess. So it's also interesting to see that, sure, there's something very practical in writing and in language, right? Just interaction. I am lost and I need to know where I'm going. But there's also something very magical for humans, at least, in the way we use the written text. So, for example, saying the name of somebody is being able to keep them alive in the afterlife for Egyptians, right? You had the ceremony of the opening of the mouth. Once somebody was dead, they needed to open their mouth in the afterlife so they can keep speaking and keep existing, right? And we say prayers, like we say amen, you know, like we have to say it to be able for it to exist. There is something that is deeply human in the way we interact and we choose to keep our words somewhere. And I like that in Star Wars, it's always kind of it's a mean to an end, you know, the keeping of the Jedi text, and then you see a prop here and there, like a Grimoire.
Right. Well, we do have that Sith dagger, the fact that C-3PO is not allowed to speak that Sith language, that he's programmed not to. And so
that's totally where I was going, and I forgot where I was going.
Okay, yeah. Again, words have power.
Yeah.
And so maybe him saying it is actually a bad thing because it brings some of that power out. That dark side just happens with saying those words in that language.
And you don't read from the Necronomicon, you know that. But yes, speaking the words, you know, like Bloody Mary, like this, there's power in saying the words. And that's what I really liked about the Sith script. There's that power of the language and that power of the script that can be evil with quotation mark, which I found really interesting because really in tunes with the ancient use of language. So, for example, one of the things that I always found fascinating, and I found one, it's a Defixio tablet. So Romans and like around the Mediterranean, basically, what you would do. So for example, James, I don't know, you stole a job I really wanted, or and I'm done with you. Or Melissa stole my man, and I really am done with her. I need an intervention from, you know, something beyond. And people would use like those lead sheets and would write on those lead sheet with basically a stylus, a metallic stylus, and they will carve the lead and use the fixture tablet or curses to somebody, and they have sometime those little like incantations that are not Latin or that are not Greek, and sometimes it's Semitic languages. So you'd think like there was like the local witch that was from Carthago or something like that. Was like going around giving, and people would write that and then roll them, and the goal was to put those into the earth, but it had to go deep. So usually you find them in sewage or like under Roman baths. So they would throw them inside of a hole or in cemeteries also. And that's the same thing than that dagger, right? You're not supposed to read it. If you read it, something, and the name of the person is written, what they've done is written, and it's always problem with money or a problem with sex. It's never something else. Like most of the time, it's like, they stole my money or they stole my man.
The age-old issues that people have. And it's like, it's really funny that you live on because somebody curses you for, you know, you did them wrong, but it's like you're recorded for posterity as being a jerk. That like
we have nothing else of that person except their name and they're
a jerk.
And that's the interesting thing also around archaeology and epigraphy, I would say, is that we have the object, right? And we have the language, but there was most probably such a lot of things around it. Like, did you have to do it at night? Did you have to do it certain nights? Would have to be like a full moon? Was there something you needed to say when you put it in the earth? Like, there's a lot of things we don't know, but we know that like most probably people wouldn't like to mess with it so much. Yeah. Always also the question is how much people were believing in this. I don't know how much they were believing in it. Like, I light an anti-jinx candle. I find it, you know, soothing, but do I believe in it? I don't know. So it's interesting also that they really believe that thing about that dagger. it seems to be like not questionable. Like nobody's like, it's not by reading a thing that you're gonna get anything. Nothing ever bad ever happened from reading from a book, Mr. O'Connell.
Nothing ever.
Nothing. So that's also a whole thing, like the lore of people, the belief of people. We don't have them so much, right? Yeah. It is interesting that you have kind of a glimpse of that in Star Wars. A little bit, you know? I always say that the big difference between Star Wars and Star Trek is a world that is like governed by science, right? And Star Wars, we don't really know what governs Star Wars in general. Is it belief? Is it friendship? Is it community? Is it fight against the fascism? Like, what is the cohesive thing around Star Wars? Like, and we don't know. I don't know personally.
Gonna say it's like friendship, that the heroes are the heroes because they're likable people and they get along together. And, you know, how did they win in Rise of Skywalker? It's people coming together, not being alone. Mm-hmm. So that's my thoughts.
Okay. I think we do have to start wrapping up.
Oh, I love languages. So
yeah. Lots to talk about, lots to cover, but well, Giraffe, I'm curious who your favorite Star Wars character is.
Ooh,
and do you cosplay any Star Wars characters?
I cosplay Garsa Whip from The Mandalorian because Miss Beale is the best, let's be honest. And you know I like everything pretty when it comes to cosplay, so she's the prettiest.
Yeah.
So I do that. I also made an entire Jedi outfit from the High Republic just because I like the bling and it was really fun to make like these gold tones. So I also do that. But I would say my favorite character, I think it's Chopper.
Nice.
I like the chaos of that character. I like that in a universe where everybody is being good or pretending to be good or like having such like strong moral grounds. Sometimes they're wrong, right? Moral grounds, but everybody has such strong moral goals. Chopper is just here to do crimes. And I relate to that.
Love it.
I just admire it. I'm too much of a goody two shoes. Like when you're just like throwing people out of ships. This is incredible that Star Wars just went like, we're gonna have a war crime droid going around. I like the boldness of the character. There's not one episode with a Chopper where I'm not like, yeah, it's Chopper.
Amazing. I love it. And well, I always love that the credit, I think, for Chopper's voice is always just Chopper. Isn't that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just like delightful.
And it's such a character, like fully, like he has opinions, right?
Oh, yeah.
He's unhappy about doing the good thing. And I feel that in a world building where everybody is just so ready to sacrifice themselves to the cause, Chopper is not. And I'm like, yeah, Chopper.
Womp, 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 womp.
Yeah, exactly.
So where can people find you online? You have your own podcast as well. Tell us about that.
Every Thursday, we are live with Strange New Pod at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time on YouTube. I'm one of the co-hosts. We review and love all Star Trek. Right now, there's no new Star Trek, but new Star Trek is coming soon, 15th of January with Starfleet Academy. We're really pumped about this. Yeah. So you can find Strange New Pod everywhere at Strange New Pod. I'm about a Giraffe. You can find me on Blue Sky. You can find me on Instagram. These are more about my cosplay. And I think the next convention I'm going to be at is going to be WonderCon. Yeah, I'm around Southern California. I do a lot of conventions. Wherever you see Melissa, I'm usually not very far.
It's true. It's true. So delightful. Excellent. Well, thanks, Giraffe. This was a super fun conversation. As is clear, we could keep talking for an hour, especially you and James, just language deeper and deeper and deeper. But we appreciate you coming and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much. If you want to discover Star Trek, hit me up. We're on the other side.
We could easily come over and talk Star Trek.
Let's go.
Yeah, that's really my favorite. If people only listen to me about one thing, the fact that you don't have to choose between these franchises is like my main talking point.
Yeah, so. I am about every franchise. I love Stargate, Marvel, DC, you name it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
This was so much fun. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Giraffe, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
If you're looking for the links and other things that we talked about during this episode, check out our show notes page available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our YouTube channel where we host some episodes with related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Blue Sky or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. Also check out our fan group on Facebook, the Star Warsologies podcast fan group. Come and join and chat with us. If you have ideas, no topic is off limits, even if there are X-Wings, Y-Wings, A-Wings, and B-Wings. Are there Q-Wings? And are Z-Wings called Z-Wings in Britain?
And please also rate and review and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service and share it with your friends who are geeky about languages.
You can check out my first book. It's Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away from Chronicle Books, available at your local bookstore or on bookshop.org, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including the Max FX podcast, the Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.